Hi guys, my name is Emily, and today I'm here to film my October 2016 wrap-up. I started off October with Neil Gaiman's Fortunately the Milk. I kept seeing this at work. This is a really cute piece of fantasy literature, fantasy in like a very loose sense. It's targeted towards readers 6 to 8 years old. This is about a family whose mother goes off and leaves the father in charge of taking care of the family. And so he realizes that for breakfast there isn't any milk, and he goes out to get the milk, and he just doesn't come back for a really long time. And the kids are kind of useless, and they sit around like, oh, I'm so hungry, but I can't eat because I don't have milk. And then eventually the dad comes back and he's like, so I got abducted by aliens. And the kids are like, right. And then he tells this whole story about how his trip to go get milk went awry. And it was fun, it had me laughing out loud. I loved this. The next book I read was The Nest by Kenneth Oppel. I picked this up at the Telling Tales Festival in September. I got Kenneth Oppel to sign it, which was pretty exciting. This was really, really good. This is the story of a boy named Steve whose family is sort of struggling because his newborn baby brother is very, very sick, and his family situation is really tense. His parents are constantly in the hospital trying to keep their baby son alive. Stephen, who is a fairly anxious boy with some other mental health issues, starts to have these dreams in which angels talk to him about how they're going to fix the baby. And it sort of goes off from there. It's very spooky, but it has a lot of things that I feel like could make great teaching points if you read this with your class or with your kids. And I do have a review and discussion for this coming up soon, so I'm not going to say too much more. But I loved this, and keep an eye out for my 2 future videos. The next thing I read was Wenjack by Joseph Boyden. So this is a story based on the real Cheney Wenjack, who was in the residential schools and who died, and whose death sort of caused some questions to be asked about the residential school system. Let me just read you the synopsis because this is what sold me on it. An Ojibwe boy runs away from a North Ontario Indian school, not realizing just how far away home is. Along the way, he's followed by Manitous, spirits of the forest who comment on his plight, cajoling, taunting, and ultimately offer him a type of comfort on his difficult journey back to the place where he was so brutally removed from. A very brief but poignant look at the damage that the residential school system did. A really haunting part of our legacy as Canadians that I feel like not enough people know about. Like, I can't remember residential schools coming up in my Canadian history ever, because every time we learned Canadian history, they started at like the beginning of time when white people came to Canada, and so like over and over we learned about like colonization, but we didn't call it colonization, especially not in the younger grades. And then we would go through like how we gained our independence, how we fought in the world wars, that kind of stuff. We never made it to contemporary Canadian history. Even in grade 10, we didn't make it past World War II. The last residential school was shut down in 1996, so residential schools are still fairly recent. Like within my lifetime, we still had residential schools open. So it is a very real, raw trauma that has really affected the Indigenous communities, and we don't talk about it enough. So I feel like this is such an important text, and if this is the gateway into Indigenous literature for you, because I've taken a course on Indigenous literature, so I've kind of already started to think through and unpack this part of Canadian history. But if you haven't, this might be an interesting place to start. So I would highly recommend that you check this out. Then I read The Great Ghost Rescue by Ibbotson, and I did a buddy reads with Amanda Center for this. Links to her channel in the description box down below. It was a really, really fun read. So it's about a boy. Well, it starts off with a boy ghost named Humphrey, who is really not horrible. His name is Humphrey the Horrible, but he's really not horrible at all. He isn't spooky or smelly or creepy looking, and he can't really scare people. Humphrey and his family end up uprooted as these old places where ghost haunts are slowly being turned into like bed and breakfast places and tourist destinations, so ghosts around the UK are losing the places that they like to haunt. Humphrey ends up meeting a living boy named Rick, and Rick decides to go to his member of parliament and argue for a ghost sanctuary, a place where all the ghosts can go and haunt because every citizen has political rights, including dead ones. I thought it was a really cool book. I thought the sort of adoptive, non-traditional family that Humphrey is a part of was really interesting. I thought the idea that young people can be political, very interesting. It's a really fun read that I think if you really wanted to, you could pull a lot out of and make a sort of interesting paper out of. After The Great Ghost Rescue, I read Daphne du Maurier's Rebecca. I did a buddy read with Emily Boone here on YouTube. So this is the story of a young woman who marries this significantly older man as his second wife because his first wife, Rebecca, has recently died, and so she comes back to his family estate, Manderley, and it's really, really hard for her to take the place of Rebecca. Rebecca has ridiculously hard shoes to fill because she was just perfection. It is this young woman's struggles to sort of fit into the house, and then of course some weird stuff happens. Emily and I checked in once a week with each other, and she had seen the movie but not read the book, and I hadn't been exposed to anything. So I didn't know what was happening, but she kind of had an idea where it was going. I alternated between like legitimately supernatural, some sort of nefarious plot, something more Hannibal Lecter-y, something more predatory, to the narrator just being unreliable and reading into these things. I was all over the place in terms of expectations for the ending, and let me just say that I did not foresee the ending that I got. Final thing I read in October is actually my least favorite thing, and that is Queen of Shadows, a Throne of Glass novel by Sarah J. Maas. Now, I have a sort of love-hate relationship with this series. I got sucked into the first one. Everybody was talking about it. They were talking about how much they loved Selena, how awesome she was. So of course, I picked it up. I was actually thinking of including the series in my thesis project, so I was like, hey, badass lady of fantasy literature. But the more I read of the series, the less and less I like Selena. She gets everything, and one of the flaws that I find in this text, we get the point of views of different characters. You would think that when you are in Selena's head, her own narrative voice, that you wouldn't be keeping secrets from yourself, but it seems like often from Selena's perspective, we are not seeing or hearing about the things that she's doing, and then all of a sudden later in the text everything will fall into place because at some point, some secret point that we didn't get to see in Selena's own head, she planned out this whole thing and she'd been putting something together this whole time and we never see that. And so all of a sudden you hit a point in the novel where there's a problem and everything just falls into place like dominoes because Selena set it up when we weren't looking, and that I find frustrating. The other thing I'm finding frustrating that I'm seeing recurring throughout the text is you have this character who you as a reader are introduced to, you see in their narrative perspective, in their head, and they're confident in their identity as X. And then another character will walk in and be like, you, based on your facial features, are clearly the heir of this important person. Hello, king or queen, whatever. Have a new identity. And the person's like, oh yes, this is my new identity. And they fully embrace this new identity. I find that shift in identity that easily happens, and like the person all of a sudden realizes that they knew it all along, or like all along in their head they were thinking of themselves as somebody else. How can I phrase this because it's convoluted? A character will identify as this sort of mask that they're playing, and all along we are reading them as their mask, and then information is revealed to us and suddenly they remember that they're actually somebody else and they drop the mask in their internal narrative. And it's weird. It's really weird. I think some of these things are just really messy. Did Sarah J. Maas not have a plan for this series? But I keep reading them because I think some of the things that are happening in the world are pretty interesting. I really like some of the other characters. I am continuing to read because I want to see what happens, but as I read it, I'm sitting here going, this is such a train wreck. So those are all of the things that I read in October. Let me know what your favorite read was this October. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you soon. Bye!